less important is a strong claim. I think.
I'm willing to stand behind it. I mean, I think that probably a large percentage of chronic disease in America is caused by the removal of these phytonutrients from our food. So like processed foods are basically just the macros and none of the nutrients.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think for the like overall body function, if you tried to survive on like superfood gummies, you probably not have a very long life expectancy exclusively on superfood gummies.
I mean, there's been people who have done like diets on junk food and done well. Like if you like calorically restrict on junk food, you can lose weight if you can like set up your life to where it works. But
No,
but no, there's a lot of there's like anti-inflammatory compounds. There's like
I see. So your claim is spherically deformable units applied to everything in our life, including diets and stuff like that.
no, I just wanted to. I was like, I need slide backgrounds. Maybe there'll be a last minute change, and I'll talk about this instead of like spherical
Okay.
units. And so.
Okay, well then let's start our presentation with on that note. There might be a last minute change, so prepare for surprise, like in a good Korean movie.
Yeah, if we run out of things to talk about, I can rant about that, I guess. Okay, so the actual diagnosis part of the problem of brain health can be related to this topic. And we're looking for cortical attribute maps, and some might call them parcellations, segmentations on a manifold, or whatever you want to call them. But so basically, predicting these attribute maps gives you some concept of brain health. And the spherically deformable unit is one of the top of the line methods of doing so. The graphic here, it shows like a typical cortical surface that some of the methods that I've worked on would generate. The two spheres are basically these like spherically mapped versions of those surfaces that preserve geodesic distances, and I'll talk more about that later.
And colors are second derivative.
The colors, so it depends. Those are attributes basically. So like they're.
It looks like the curvature in this case.
Yeah. Those are one of the primary attributes that they use as input to get further classifiers and whatnot. So basically, this is just like a why do we care kind of slide. So basically, like the paper focuses on infant analysis. So if you get that analysis adequate enough, then you can have more timely interventions to hopefully improve long-term outcomes. I could think of a handful of background slides that would have been useful in this, but one of the most basic and fundamental ones is just like talking about the distortions that occur between different representations of data. So like the cortical surface is not a sphere exactly. It's topologically equivalent to a sphere, but it's not geometrically equivalent to a sphere. And when you deform that surface into a sphere, you get distortions, just as you might when you deform a globe onto a surface. And the red marks basically show where like distortions occur in Mercator projections. So yeah, so this goes to what Sergey was talking about earlier. So basically there's in subsequent slides, you'll see that curvature, sulcal depth, and average complexity are very common inputs to these spherical architectures is the channels. And you can see that the spherical and the planar projections of these different attribute maps, and the white part, the far left part, the projection rule, basically it is a diagram to help you understand what type of properties are being preserved in these projections. So they're basically trying to find a spherical mapping such that the distances from point to point are distorted minimally, and the angles between sets of points are distorted minimally. And the architectures, I think would be, they're not that different from regular convolutional architectures. They consist of convolutional operations, pooling, and fully connected layers for classification tasks, and several channels for input.
Is it the same network? They just stack the channels, or there is a three networks?
My understanding is that I think they stack the channels, but the patches are processed independently. So like there's actually a layer of detail. This is all related work section. But there's a layer of detail to most of these papers that in this paper in particular, they're projecting onto like a tangent plane, some image, and they do that for each little patch, and those patches are processed independently. So they map the projection to the architecture, and that's the thing that's a little bit hard to keep track of throughout all the related works. Is like there's really subtle nuances on how how much faithfulness they're actually, like where the sphere is like a concept that doesn't necessarily like have to be reflected in the architecture. Sometimes they map the spherical image to a planar architecture, and sometimes they map a planar image to a spherical architecture, and it gets kind of confusing to keep track of all that. But so this is what what at least some type of parcellation would look like on a inflated surface. So the top component is the manual labeling, and or actually the left-hand component is the manual labeling, and the top component is the spherically inflated surfaces. But basically the point of this slide is to show you that the different types of classification that occur on these types of surfaces. There's a lot of different types of deformations that are done on these surfaces in the way they're displayed. Sometimes you'll see with no gyri and sulci, and some such as the top layer and the third from the top. And sometimes you'll see with folds, but looks like it's been inflated a little bit, like the second layer and the fourth layer. And neither of those are actually the cortical surface, as cortical surface reconstruction would demonstrate them. They've been inflated to some extent. And so jumping to another paper, this paper focuses on classification tasks instead of, I mean, in some sense, parcellation is a high dimensional classification task. So each one of these colors is a different class. And there's many vertices that compose these regions. So, and it's definitely a classification task, but not in the sense that I'm using it here. This is like a low dimensional classification task on some sort of demographic such as gender. This specifically, this paper focuses on being able to classify gender from cortical information. And the way they do that is not that different from the way you would do it with an image or a 3D MRI. You use a series of convolution and pooling operations to reduce the dimensionality to the point where a multi-layer perceptron can do the actual classification from the feature representation. So the main advantage here is that you're kind of you have the capacity to work with a new type of data structure. Later on, there's papers that add properties of equivariance, which is really interesting. There's one paper in particular that has pretty strong equivariant, rotational equivariant properties. So it's like, doesn't matter how you rotate the sphere, you'll still get the same representation in your latent space that you can classify from. And that's nice. So another concept that comes into it has to be sort of mapped into this concept of spherical representations from convolution is how you're going to perform the convolution operation itself and how the patches or filters will get created. And it seems like to me that the meshes definitely aren't going to conform to the first two types of patching strategies. So the first and second patching strategy, you're expecting the sphere to have a regular grid on it, which couldn't possibly happen. And it also the part E and part B are expecting there to be nice circular regions that are regular in their spacing, but that wouldn't make sense as you can imagine. As you move from node to node, that perfect regular pattern doesn't really appear at each node. So they most likely have to do some interpolation to keep that assumption to have such a patching strategy. I think more realistically, if you're not using interpolation between the nodes, then the third patching strategy makes the most sense, because you're basically like you could probably have regular triangles and thus a polygonal patch grid makes sense. So this is analogous to the 3x3 grids that you see in image 2D image convolution, or 3x3 grids that you would see in 3D image convolution. So basically, like each one of the nodes in these grids has a weight associated with it, just like you would for a convolutional filter in the traditional sense. You multiply that element wise by the node values to get the output. And so the interesting thing, I guess, in some sense, is that the pulling and convolutional neural networks reduces dimensionality. But when you have a sphere, usually starting with some number of nodes like 40,000 or 140,000 or something like this, and they tend to be like orders of icosahedrons in some situations, and the pulling operation can kind of like traverse the opposite direction of going, instead of going up in dimensionality or going down. So you still have a sphere, but you have a sphere with fewer nodes after a pulling operation. And this diagram just drives home that most of these architectures are alternating convolution and pulling operations to reduce dimensionality. Like you can see that this you start with the surface, you have to transform it to a sphere, which isn't thoroughly described in many of these papers. My guess is that they rely on FreeSurfer to do this transformation for their underlying data, so that's why it's poorly described in many of the papers. But
wait, it's just like inflation.
Yeah, it's inflation,
and
also it's usually a remeshing after the inflation, so they conform the number of vertices to be some fixed amount for the
yeah, I didn't know about remeshing.
yeah. So for this task, this is probably a lot of the papers in the related work section were from like 2017 era. So basically, like they compare against an SVM for gender classification after this dimensionality reduction that they do, and they were able to beat SVM, which seems reasonable. So the this paper, this was the Monet paper, this is from Bronstein's group. This paper was actually really interesting to read, but it was extremely hard to distill in a way that I could easily do in the time that I had left. So, this paper goes into, and I don't have on the slides, but it goes into some, how they do spectral, they basically use eigenvalue decomposition on a graph Laplacian to define their convolutional operation. And it seems like really elegant. They also talk about how, like, if you have different graphs, the eigenvalue decomposition doesn't work, transfer from graph to graph. Which would be one incentive to have everything in the same same number of vertex sphere, because then you have like the language of the eigenvalue decomposition translates because it's always the same. But I didn't go into further detail than that here. The thing that I think that translates into the architecture that I'm ultimately going to describe is this thing called superpixels that they do on MNest, which I thought was pretty cool. So like basically normally you'll get like a regular grid for convolution where like the adjacency is assumed to be pixel is adjacent to a pixel right next to it. And for convolution, that's like the inductive bias that's like a given from the beginning. But one of the reasons that I'm kind of like fascinated by GNNs is because you don't have to abide by that assumption. You can technically rewire the adjacency matrix of certain things in such a way to artificially increase the receptive field in ways that you think might be useful. So they did a classification task on MNIST where they use this let's see if I can call it. So they use this region to do the classification task, and using this improves their accuracy significantly over other methods that don't use this. So at least in the constraints, which are important. But
So it's just non-uniform grid.
yeah. And so that's so one of the title of this is like a spherical deformable unit, which is builds upon deformable convolution. And I think this is sort of like a precursor to deformable convolution. Like I'll talk about that later. So on manifolds, they use the network that they're using to look for correspondence between shapes, which if you could do well on that, you could probably do parcellation on a manifold. So this is the paper that had the emphasis on equivariance that I thought was important. So basically, if you're not familiar, one of the Bronstein's sort of like claims to fame was his he kind of put forward a survey paper, I think, with like maybe some other famous people that talked about all of the inductive biases that are inherent in neural networks that they want to kind of improve upon. And one of the things is if you rotate your data in a convolutional neural network, and your downstream task will degrade significantly unless you do data augmentation. And data augmentation sort of subtracts from the capacity of the network. So you're kind of like, you're probably not going to get as high of accuracy value as if you always got the same representation of the data going into your MLP. So basically, rotational equivariance is like trying to have the feature map look the same with certain types of symmetry, and specifically rotation. And they define, they also go in this paper into the things that I was kind of mentioning related to MONET, which was they define their convolutional operation based on eigenvalue decomposition of the graph Laplacian. And they come up with these harmonic these spherical harmonic values that they can use in their convolutional filter. I didn't go into much further, but it seemed plausible. And they also define the same task for the pooling operation. They talk about the next slide makes this a little bit clearer, so I'll just skip to the next slide. But they at the end of their architecture, they, after all of their spherical operations that are defined based on the harmonics that they find from the eigenvalue to composition, they get a feature representation. They do weighted global average pooling on that, and the global average pooling per filter results in something that is rotationally equivariant. So they have all these different TIE fighters or what X-wings or whatever they're called, and they rotate them. The rows of this image are sort of like the latent representation, but you can see even though that the rotations are different, the latent representation is the same. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, I don't know like how much information you're going to lose in weighted global average pooling, but I know they use things like this in certain variants of transformers and stuff for like to replace. I covered a paper that replaced the class token with a global average pooling once. So that's cool. So this is another paper that the image is distorted, but the architecture creates the patching from knowing about the distortion in such a way that the distortion doesn't affect the results that much. And this is sort of just like a precursor to some of the spherical unit stuff. It's just important to be aware that there's distortion or in the grid that they're creating. They have to interpolate according to an equation that's defined later. So they have an equation that basically maps between the spherical image and the architecture in such a way that the architecture sees a canonical representation of the image. So this just kind of tells you that like you can handle the distortions either in your architecture through the different architectural biases that you pick, or you can handle it in the transformations you do to your data to some extent. Okay, so deformable convolution. I heard Sergey mention this a really long time ago, so I think he probably knows a fair bit about it. It seems like it's kind of doing in convolution some of the things that people expect of attention. That you basically the convolutional the individual bits of the convolutional filter, instead of having implied adjacency of their nearest neighbor, they can be any kind of anywhere. And I can kind of draw like circle what I'm thinking of right now. Yeah, so like the top part of this image, like there's the offsets of the convolution are learned as part of the backpropagation. So the effect of this is that you'll see that these offsets will focus on certain parts of the image more than others for certain tasks. And that's interesting because it's attention-like, but not attention. This was a spatial transformer that was only operating on fairly simple data sets like MNIST, but I thought it was pretty cool because it performs an affine transformation of the data before it does the classification task. So it makes sense that you'd kind of want to maximize your confidence or whatever. I mean, it doesn't talk about confidence in the paper, but like you'd want to find the orientation of your data that your downstream test network is familiar with. And if you could learn that transformation, that would be beneficial. And all of these papers that I read, and papers that I've read that I'm not discussing today, like registration before you use your network improves results. It's just like you can use data augmentation to get around that, but you might have a network specialized in that to handle learning the transformation before you go into the networks that aren't specialized in that. And that I think, I mean, our data sets in neuroimaging are kind of small in terms of number of subjects compared to like the toy data sets that people like hammer for really high accuracy results on like ImageNet and stuff. So I think one of the reasons that we're able to achieve the results we achieve is because of all the upfront processing we do, like motion correction and like the affine transformations and the contrast normalizations and stuff like this. This just basically gets the number of permutations of your input lower, and the space is probably much easier to partition for the downstream task. And anybody that wants to sort of take these networks out of the domain of we're doing how we're working on highly processed data, we're working on raw data in the wild, which is I think the ultimate goal. You're going to have to probably think about somebody at some point will probably address the augmentations that are occurring in our pre-processing pipelines that enable us to have good results. And you can do that with a network, and I think you can do that to some extent with some of the stuff y'all are working on with like Wirehead and whatnot. There's a lot of ways to deal with it. One of which would be to learn some transformations to apply before downstream networks do what they do. So getting to the methodology of the paper that I'm actually supposed to be giving a talk on, it's not all that different from many of the previous things. Primary concept is so it's UNet. So it's not all that different from basic UNet. There's a decoder and an encoder, or an encoder and a decoder, and one does a dimensionality reduction and one does upsampling. And there's skip connections across, but we're operating on spheres, so it's the regular grids, and they operate on the assumption that your data comes in one of the orders of the icosahedrons, and it does downsampling through the orders of icosahedrons. And they define these different ring filters that behave like convolutions in the traditional sense. These filters operate on either one ring, which it would be like your nearest neighbor, or two rings, which would be like your second order neighbor. And they perform convolution and pooling, so they they have these weighted matrices that are shared parameters that they use throughout the operation. The pooling operation reduces vertices by n plus 6 divided by 4 vertices, and there's some irregularity in this downsampling process between vertices that have 6 or 5 neighbors. The nice effect of the pooling operation is it maintains spherical topology throughout the downsampling process. So the upsampling process is essentially transposed convolution defined in the spherical space, which basically overlapping vertices are summed to restore the original feature map and ensure consistent upsampling across the spherical surface. So, as you can see here, the architecture is not unlike any other unit that we've seen. The main thing is that you have to take the input cortical surface and transform it into a sphere where you can have access to all these spherical operations.
Are they concatenating or adding the resolutions, skip connections? Do you know?
I don't know. I would think they are add, but I don't know.
The original, as I was surprised to find out, the original architecture doesn't add, but concatenate,
Okay.
and many people concatenate.
Yeah, whenever I come across the opportunity to tweak with that I'm always curious if like anybody's done like a very small paper demonstrating what the effectiveness of concatenation versus addition on skip connections, like that'd be a nice micro paper, but I don't know, I'm sure it's probably some paper already.
Maybe on archive or in a blog post somewhere.
Yeah. So the dice scores for this are quite high, at least on the data sets that they're operating on. So like 92% are 0.93 dice score. They noticed that 4 deformable convolutional layers are enough to get this. So in the GNNs that I've used, four GNN layers also tends to be a nice sweet spot. But in the parcellation that I did, you can beef that up a little bit, and the best results I had were like 11 layers. So I think it's highly task specific.
11, you mean down the stream and then 11 up, right?
We don't. I wasn't using spherical unit. I was using gravitation. So
Only 11, yeah, but here what they mean only one branch, right? The compression branch, the other branch is identical.
I thought it was always the same, but yeah, that's a good question. I haven't thought this through the way I should have.
And the fact that it's even number, they have an extra couple of layers, I guess. Oh, no. Good, still. Any 6 and 6. Like there is this middle layer, or the autoencoder layer, that doesn't have a cover.
Mm-hmm.
So probably +1.
Yeah.
Like when they say 2 deformable convolution layers in the net, they mean 5 layers in the autoencoder architecture. 2, the bottleneck, and another 2.
Oh, okay.
It's probably what they mean.
So yeah, this is probably this is closer to some of the practical stuff that we've wanted to know about most of the architectures, which is just like the total number of parameters in the architecture and the inference time. So their takeaway was that the spherical deformable operations increase model complexity slightly, but significantly increase the inference time. So there's the accuracy comes at a price, but for the tasks that we're doing, when compared with classical methods, these are still significantly faster. This is less sub 1 second for all of these methods. So if you compare with like portions of pre-surfer Python, it's much worse. So yeah, just more dice scores.
So I found out recently that this dice scores are not like above 90. Well, it depends on number of classes, but above certain point, those dice scores are completely non-representative of what you see in the results.
Yeah, like sometimes you see defects that, and like you can have a high
capture, and sometimes there are no defects, and they're highly, like from my point of view, and we highly capture.
Right, yeah, I agree with that observation, because you can create something that looks really aesthetically pleasing, but has a bad die score,
Mhm.
and you can do the opposite as well.
Mhm.
So, it, like Fast Surfer, I would say kind of fell into that category of, having aesthetically pleasing surfaces, but
Low
their
res-
die score was questionable, cause like, depending on how you calculated it, but, they had, so their surface didn't match resurface surface, so to calculate the die score, like,
interpolation.
kind of badly defined. So you have to define it yourself, which was, I did it in the nearest neighbor fashion, so like. When you define it in the nearest neighbor fashion, because the surface is in the wrong place, then. The die score drops, but it still looks good because it's overlaying that surface and inside of the. 3D grid of a segmentation to do its results, so. It kind of necessarily has the right number of connected components. So like you don't have any like weird connected component issues where they're in the wrong place or anything. But things are shifted in the wrong place, so the borders are all in the wrong place, basically. And that's sort of interesting. Aspect of the die score and the surfaces. So, oh yeah, what I wanted to go through here a little bit was, so. Something I didn't do in my parcellation results, I think it might have been learned by the network fairly well, but. The features that they use for their parcellations, and many of the papers used for parcellation is. Curvature and sulcal depth and like all these like attributes of the mesh that you can embed into the vertex. They embed into their input, so. And that's primarily what they're doing their classification from, so. They're not doing that. I think adding those values might improve the parcellation results that I had. That would be something that would be worth experimenting on for the paper that I need to write next. Yeah. So that's pretty much it, except for. Different. Measures of performance for their cortical thickness maps, but. This is roughly the end. So essentially, it's just worth mentioning that like. They define their convolutional operation in spherical space. They increase accuracy and there's some really interesting papers out there about the spherical harmonics and the graph Laplacians and spectral definitions of convolution, but I think are interesting. But they capture, from what I understand, their strength is like. They capture global information better than they capture local information, so. I mean, the accuracy results of this paper were very compelling, and 93 die score is very high in the space. But
This is Jessica Filiano, the 104 region.
I don't think so, I doubt it. Because of the time it was
It's
written.
only, but it's only on the surface of the, it's on the cortical surface, so no subcortical regions, etc. So still a lot, right?
Yeah, I think it's probably like 36 classes or something like that.
Well, then, I don't know, well, 86,
I've seen papers with like 95, 97 dice from modern, like papers when I wasn't specifically focusing on this. The reason I focused on this paper is because the guy in the babies channel that's new, he's a postdoc, it's like. Yeah. He, like, when I wrote my parcellation paper, like, I basically envisioned the comments, like the most likely comment I would get would be like, what about spherical unit or whatever? And he mentioned that he wanted to work with spherical unit, so I wanted to see what they had done in their architecture in the event that I needed to like pivot to doing that in some short sort of Hail Mary type of thing. But I think the nice thing about spherical unit is it makes the data representation dimensionality reduced, which I think makes downstream tasks easier. So it's,
Well, if your task is segmentation, then you don't need to reduce anything, but if your task is classification of some sort, then yes, or regression, right? Like single or fewer parameters.
yeah, inherent in many of the parcellation methods is spherical registration, which is an interesting related topic to this. So the portion where they do the transformation to the spherical space, I think that would be termed spherical registration in some sense. Maybe I'm wrong. But there's this conversion of the cortical surface into a sphere, and then they remesh. And then they can have a one-to-one correspondence between all the vertices and the mesh that you generated and transformed in the mesh that's the average template that people use for group studies. So this is where the sort of the Bruce Fischel's bread and butter in this, it seems to be group studies in a lot of situations. I mean, they do a lot of things up there, but ultimately, it seems like they create new architectures, then after that, there's a group study. And they create new architecture.
Well, that's what you're doing. You created a new architecture, next is group study.
Yeah.
See if their approaches on average give you the same predictive power statistically.
Yeah, and there's increased predictive power when you sort of operate on these group templates, it seems, based on what I've seen. And it's just an important step of the group.
Yeah, but for precision medicine and things. why would
Right,
you
so
need
that's the
group?
thing that we're conflicted with, it's like we kind of operated in the pre-group study space.
Yeah, we want to be in some.
Because because you get like individualized group medicine, there's like all these, so like trying to create an average brain there really isn't an average brain that's like sufficiently representative to cover everybody.
Mhm.
So you lose some information when you map into these group study spaces. That would possibly be useful for personalized medicine and stuff like this, so. Anyway, there's a lot of, that's what I'm saying, going back to show and tell, when you're working on the proposal, there's so many different things you can think of to do that you need to nail it down, because you could do years and years and years of spinning your wheels. Anyway, so that's the majority of this presentation.
Question time. What do we like?
I'm kind of, I wish I had time to go into like the implementation details of all these papers. Because I saw that a lot of them use FreeSurfer as a benchmark, and I've heard from a lot of people that FreeSurfer was terrible in inference based.
Yeah, and I heard also recently that FreeSurfer was not good in the adolescent space as well, so I don't know.
So that makes it interesting if you're using FreeSurfer as your baseline.
Yeah, as your silver truth of some sort.
Yeah. Whether or not what your method says. High accuracy on a bad result is not particularly desirable. It just kind of tells you that the neural network's able to learn.
Yeah, do whatever it can tune. And also this dice non-representativeness of the dice score tells me, and also the millions of parameters tells me that we can create useful tools that are actually capable in terms of delivery to the end user, and they can work on our laptops and stuff like that. Give a dice score within 2%. That's what we're seeing. And the result the result difference may not matter at all.
Yeah,
But what we're seeing,
especially in terms of diagnosis, like the diagnosis is inherently low dimensional task, so.
yeah. But that's true. But like you don't want to be totally wrong. Like sometimes somebody's models get eye sockets and things like that. So we want to do reasonably well, but there is a limit to it. And plus we're tuning it to FreeSurfer. as you said, is it the ground truth? It's not. There's another problem. Yeah, like with tons of parameters, we basically know that we can train the model to capture the tail of the distribution. Probably variations. It can memorize the tails as well, not just the mode. But again, the question is how useful it is. I guess that it's useful in some cases, like LLM is a library. People want everything to be in the library. We just don't want to be the common sense stuff. That case is maybe it's just too expensive to store a country model. Okay, yeah, thanks for that. But this also sounded like a review paper in a sense, right? You covered a lot of. other
Yeah,
papers.
I tried to get out of it. I didn't, my preparation was more me preparing for writing than it was me preparing for the presentation. I was trying to get breadth. So I didn't get sidetracked, sideswiped later on by not being aware of all these different things that are going on. But the hardest presentations that I've done in this MLBBQ sequence that we've done have always been when I try to do breadth. Because like, there's no satisfying way to present breadth, like, I mean, that I've been able to do. Like, I tried to present a survey paper that was exclusively breadth. I tried to present I think it was one of Bronstein. And that was just hard. That was like the worst presentation that I think I've ever done. And just because there's like so many concepts and like every line was just like critically dense information that required tons of background to understand. So it's like, how do you present that? But yeah, I don't know. I think
Let me stop the recording there. I think we're done with this paper anyway. So
Absolutely.
we can open mic discussion.